I want to start this one off after your little recap of the review season by another recap, and that's looking at our ray tracing survey that we put up on the Hardware Unboxed community tab last week, because we spent a bit of time in the previous podcast talking about the new ray tracing testing that you had implemented for the 4070 Ti Super at the time. It was also used for the 4080 Super. And we were just wondering, what's people's interest? We'll gauge people's interest in using ray tracing at the moment. And so we published this poll. It says, when available in a game, do you usually play with ray tracing enabled? That was the question. And then people could choose from 5 different responses here. And so, well, let's just go through the results. So 52% of respondents, this had 54,000 votes on the poll, said that they do not typically use ray tracing in their games. So that was split up with 16% of people said that the visual improvement was not significant enough, and 36% of people said that the performance hit is too significant on their GPU. So 52% in total were not typically enabling ray tracing. 26% of people said that they turned it on in some games and leaved it off in some games. And then the remaining 21% of people, I believe it's 21%, if my maths is correct. Yes, 21% did use ray tracing. That was 14% saying at the maximum ray tracing settings and 7% on medium or low ray tracing settings. So did those results surprise you in any way?
No, not really. I got to be honest. That's probably I mean, really, I can only go off my own experiences, and I guess, well, my own personal experiences, and then my experiences with my friends group, like the guys I game with, people who I know who game. Of course, you're included in that. Balin's included in that, and other friends that I game with. And out of all of those sort of people and my experiences, yeah, it's like ray tracing is not something that, it doesn't dominate gaming conversations. People aren't super excited about it. There's definitely been things that have happened visually in gaming that have, I don't know, sort of been more unanimously agreed upon that they're amazing and they've really improved gaming. I guess stuff like anti-aliasing or just 3D gaming to begin with. I'm going way back now, but when I started out, it was like, I remember when, I think it was like MechWarrior 3D was one of the first 3D games. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I was very young.
I probably wasn't even born,
super,
so I don't know.
Yeah, there's a good chance. But basically when true 3D gaming came along, it wasn't like do we really want 3D gaming? Is the performance hit worth it? Does it actually look, it was like, I don't remember the performance hit really being a problem back then, but just the visual improvement, like it really just redefined the whole, it would just change gaming completely. It was a whole new thing.
Yeah.
It was mind blowing. I was like, wow, okay. Because I remember at the time thinking, but I play 3D video games. But then when I actually saw these games in 3D, I was like, oh, okay, that is definitely different. So yeah, it doesn't really surprise me. I mean, look, let's be honest here. The performance hit to enable ray tracing at any kind of meaningful level is just, it's still insane. Even on high-end hardware, the performance hit is crazy. And even if you want to enjoy stuff like path tracing, you've really got to fall back on a fair bit of trickery to make that work. So
yeah,
it's definitely not a toggle on and, oh, wow, the game looks better. And I don't, like, frame rate counter aside, okay, because I think people think, I'm definitely an FPS snob, but ignoring that, let's remove the frame rate counter. Let's just play a game that only needs, 60 FPS to be enjoyable, okay? Even when you turn ray tracing on without the FPS counter, you're like, oh, this doesn't feel quite as good. I remember we did that in the office with Balin, because Balin was saying, oh, I'd only need this much performance to play Cyberpunk. And I was like, right. I think you'll notice that it doesn't feel as nice, mate. And he's like, no, I reckon with ray tracing on, that'd be okay. And then we did it without the FPS counter, and straight away he was like, oh yeah, okay, no, this doesn't feel good at all. This is, I don't like the latency, the input I'm getting at the moment. So yeah, it's still a way off.
I think some of these poll results really match with what we were talking earlier about the current landscape and why things aren't super exciting. Is that, you scroll through the comments on some of these posts, people saying 142 likes on this comment. Bold of you to assume my card is new enough to support ray tracing.
Well, look, that is true. The poll does have limitations in that sense, but I think it is the general sentiment, though, because as I talked about in the last podcast, we were looking at stuff like, I think it was the new impressive 4070 Super and what that does with ray tracing enabled. And for me personally, they're not frame rates I want to play at 1440p. And
that's a $600 GPU.
Yeah, in a lot of instances, a $600 GPU will not deliver the performance I desire with a reasonable degree of ray tracing enabled. And while ray tracing does enhance those games visually, it doesn't do it anywhere near enough to justify playing that way. I am more than happy to sacrifice a bit of visual quality to have that nice smooth, when you're panning around, when you're aiming down sights, all that sort of stuff. For me, that's the priority, I guess. And that's the easiest way to put it. For me, the priority is the input. As long as you've got good input, the game can look like whatever. Obviously, especially a single player title, the better it looks, the more immersive it is. Again, Alan Wake 2 looks phenomenal. But as phenomenal as Alan Wake 2 looks, for me, the most important thing is when I look around the environment, that it doesn't feel like a low FPS sluggish game. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, between the comment of someone saying they don't even have a card that supports ray tracing and about half of the poll respondents saying that they didn't think it was, the visual improvement or performance, it was too significant. I think that is just highly indicative of what people have bought as GPUs. You look back at the RTX 20 series generation, and a 2080 was like, what was it, $700? And then the 3080 was $700. And now the 4070 Super is $600, which is $100 less, but it hasn't exactly shifted the ray tracing calculations all that much in terms of what people have been able to do. It's still very much a case of, am I able to run it on medium settings? And we're talking about expensive GPU here. Most people aren't spending $600 on a GPU. They're spending, if they can, like $300. That's the sort of, previously people would have been spending $150, $200 on a GPU, which still can't really do ray tracing to any significant degree. And I think that's where a lot of these results come into play. And I've seen people say things like, oh, our polls are always going to be based on our audience, which is true to some degree, and that's going to be biased for reason X, Y, Z, whatever you want to say, right? But I think a lot of those opinions come from people that have bought very expensive GPUs and are thinking, well, I can't believe other people aren't playing this game with ray tracing enabled. Like, it's running really well for me. Why aren't other people experiencing this? It's like, it's because they spent $300 on their GPU or $250 and it's not good enough for that sort of scenario. So, I wouldn't say that these results have surprised me too much. It is shifting a bit. I went back and had a look at some polls from 2-3 years ago, and the opinions were more negative towards ray tracing, with certainly a lot more people either not using it, not considering it for their buying purchase, those sorts of things. So to have 50% of people, sometimes or definitely turning it on most of the time is, it's come away from where it was previously, but it's still not in the position where games can start, releasing without without the rasterization mode, for example, because if they did that, PC gaming would just die straight away because people are not willing to spend $600 on a G. Most people don't want to spend that. And if we can't do those effects, then there needs to be some significant improvement to come in that area.
Yeah, and I mean, the poll results aren't unique either to our community or our audience, because whatever claims certain individuals want to make about whether, we have a pro Radeon, which would be hilarious if that was true, because I honestly can't remember the last time I did a positive Radeon review. But anyway, that aside, the Gamers Nexus have done similar polls with similar results, and other media outlets have done the same, and they've got similar results. So our results certainly aren't out of the ordinary. If you go searching around trying to find similar evidence or data online, you're going to find a similar thing, and it makes sense, right? It's the reason why I've started to more tailor the sort of upscaling and ray tracing aspects of our reviews to the price point. So I think something like, for example, I just reviewed the RTX 4080 Super, and there, when comparing with the 7900 XTX, I felt like ray tracing was fairly relevant for a lot of people that are buying that product, and upscaling in particular very relevant because you're playing at 1440p or realistically probably 4K. Upscaling has a lot of data to pull on there, and you get a higher quality output, so that's good. But then if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum to something like an RTX 4060, it's like, come on, let's be honest. Let's be honest with ourselves. How useful is an RTX 4060 for ray tracing? Now there'll be some sort of vocal minority that'll be like, you guys don't understand, blah, 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 blah. But anyone who's tested and looked into it properly, it's not a good ray tracing product. And even upscaling is questionable when you're not using ray tracing. I don't care who you are, what your opinion is. There's no way you're using ray tracing to any noticeable degree on an RTX 4060 above 1080p, and you're doing so without upscaling. That's just not happening, right?
No.
That's not happening.
I mean, I guess part of it is potentially that game developers over time have started to create games where you kind of need upscaling to begin with. So I remember back in like the Turing generation, it was the whole discussion of you turn on ray tracing and then you turn on DLSS to reverse the performance hit, basically. But these days, the baseline really is playing games with upscaling enabled. So that a lot of that hasn't really come to play, especially for like a 4060. I imagine a lot of people that wanted to play on even like a high preset in some of these games, you'd be needing to rely on upscaling without ray tracing, which means you can't just you can't really reverse that ray tracing performance hit. It's like, are you turning it down from DLSS quality to performance?
Yeah, not that you could. That was always the biggest marketing BS.
It was very
pitch.
questionable. Yeah,
because as no, you've pointed out before, and it's the same thing with like reflex and frame generation. It's like, but you can have the other thing without the compromise, right? So you can enable upscaling to boost your FPS without having to enable ray tracing. So it's not like it's not like a feature of ray tracing. It's something you can benefit from without ray tracing. But again, my point was you need upscaling with a low-end product, but then you're at such a low resolution where upscaling doesn't work nearly as well as it does at 1440p, and certainly nowhere near as well as it does at 4K. So you end up with a very smeary, blurry image. And this is where it's highly subjective, but for me it becomes a bit messy, and I don't know, there's a lot of people clutching at straws. But these compromised ray traced configurations, so even on something like an RTX 4070, even up to maybe a 4070 Ti, when you start having to use lower quality presets with varying degrees of ray tracing, it's like how often is that actually better quality than just running the game on higher ultra at a higher resolution? You know what I mean? Like, to take advantage of ray tracing, you're often having to compromise on the resolution, which has a visual downgrade. Then you're having to use upscaling to lower resolution, which has a visual downgrade. Then you're having to lower things like shadow quality or something to free up some GPU rendering power. And then again, that degrades the image quality. But hey, now you've got ray trace reflections. So it's like the amount of compromises you've had to make to get ray traced reflections. I really question those configurations a lot of the time.
Yeah, the balancing act is pretty difficult with those sorts of things to know exactly where the line lies, especially because there are ray tracing effects that have little to no visual improvement. So you're compromising all these things to turn on a ray tracing effect that you may not really notice all that much, especially if you're not doing a lot of side-by-side comparisons. Like, you're just going into the game, you turn it on to max ray tracing, and then you start turning down other settings to preserve ray tracing. It can get very messy and is not necessarily the best way to run those sort of things. But yeah, between this podcast and last podcast, I think we've talked a lot about ray tracing, and it's been interesting to see how people's opinions evolve. I have prepared another survey for people who are just for people listening to this podcast, that I'll put as a link in the description on the YouTube video and also in the show notes for people listening to the audio version. Very, very quick, very simple 10-question survey about GPUs and related things. So it's just going to ask things like, what GPU you're currently using, how much did it cost, things like that, what features you find important, things that we can discuss about in the next podcast, just to figure out, what are you guys actually using? What are you buying? What features do you find important? Because we always have our opinions on these things, but there's only so many polls. Like, we don't want to be publishing a poll every single day on our channel. So yeah, would really appreciate if people go and just check out that survey. It's going to take a very short amount of time. It won't collect your email address or anything. I think you have to sign in just so that we don't get multiple responses, but we're not after your email or anything, just after the data. So we'll talk about that in the next episode.
We're so harvesting your data. We'll sell it to Facebook or something. Don't worry about it.
Oh, they probably already have it.
Yeah, well, they probably do. Let's be honest.